Good morning. My name is Tracy-Lynn Humby-Field, and I'm a professor at the School of Law at Wits University in Johannesburg, South Africa. This is a part of a webinar series that my faculty is putting together on the COVID-19 pandemic in South Africa. And the topic of my webinar today is hand washing as a human right, and whether it's time to revisit the 1 basin per 500 people standard. Over the past few weeks, we've had what seems to be a very good news story. Water tanks and water tankers being distributed throughout South Africa to communities who do not have access to hand washing facilities. This has been spearheaded by the Minister of Water and Sanitation and the department. The following slide gives you a sense of the scale of distribution. These are just figures that I've drawn from the media statements of the Department of Water and Sanitation, and they're not complete, but they give you some sense of the scale of the distribution of this infrastructure. The Minister directed her department to distribute this even prior to the declaration of the national disaster on 16th of March, and she said it is for emergency water for deprived, urban, overcrowded settlements and rural settlements to facilitate a culture of hand washing as a first response to the pandemic. And what I'm interested in is whether this short-term solution, they've made it very clear that it is a short-term solution, how it can be used or how it links to a longer-term intervention that supports human rights. So the questions that I want to answer in my webinar today are, firstly, where does access to hand washing facilities fit in a human rights frame? Secondly, what are the national policies and standards on hand washing facilities? And finally, who is responsible for providing and maintaining these hand washing facilities? So the first question, there are potentially a number of human rights candidates. We could situate this right underneath the right to human dignity, or the right to life, or the right to housing, or even healthcare services. These are all the rights that are protected in the Bill of Rights of the 1996 Constitution. But for a number of reasons, I think that the most appropriate right is the right of access to sufficient water, which is protected in Section 27(1)(b). And the reasons for that are many, but the three that I would highlight here are, firstly, that hand washing ordinarily requires water. We know that we can also use hand sanitizer, but there is even a definition of hand washing in our policy. It's in the National Sanitation Policy, and that makes it clear that hand washing requires water. Secondly, there is quite a well-developed international and national policy and legal framework for hand washing and basic water and its links. And finally, there are identifiable duty bearers, which is not the case with some of the other rights, for example, like human dignity, which is more diffuse. There are clear duty bearers that we can identify. So I want to talk a little bit about the international frame before moving on to the national policy and legal framework. So internationally, a right to water is recognized. The relevant source documents are the General Comment 15 on the right to water, which came from the Committee of Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, November 2002. And then only in 2010, the United Nations General Assembly recognizing an international right to water. And these international sources make it clear that states must provide water also for personal hygiene. Another international normative framework that is relevant to this issue are the Sustainable Development Goals, and Sustainable Development Goal 6, which is about ensuring the availability and sustainable management of water and sanitation for all. The first two targets there are relevant to this question of hand washing facilities. Firstly, that states must achieve universal and equitable access to affordable drinking water for all, but then target 6.2, achieving access to adequate and equitable sanitation and hygiene. Now, this is a slide taken from the Joint Monitoring Program, which is run by the World Health Organization and UNICEF, and it tracks progress, first of all, in providing drinking water, and then in sanitation facilities, and then this is very interesting, the accessibility of basic hand washing facilities in households and schools. And we can see that although South Africa is not doing too badly on the first two indicators, it seems to be lagging behind in providing basic hand washing facilities. And this is surely what prompted also this emergency water for communities to have water to wash their hands in the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, what are the national policies and standards on hand washing facilities? So the relevant law is the Water Services Act, but two policies that link up with that are firstly the National Sanitation Policy of 2016, and then secondly, national norms and standards for domestic water and sanitation services, which were finalized in September 2017. And those norms and standards are issued in terms of the Water Services Act. The Water Services Act makes it clear that everyone has a right of access to basic water and basic sanitation. If we look at the National Sanitation Policy, what it says, firstly, that a minimum acceptable level of sanitation includes a toilet and hand washing facility. So it's not just a toilet, but you also need the hand washing facility. That this basic sanitation facility must facilitate hand washing. That basic services are a human right, and that there should be universal access to sustainable sanitation services in all human settlements. And then what I think is very important here is that interim basic sanitation services should be provided in temporary informal settlements. So these are settlements that have not yet been upgraded, they're not yet formal townships, but even in these informal settlements, the state must be providing interim basic sanitation services. So the million-dollar question is, what is an interim basic sanitation service? And for that, we turn to the national norms and standards for domestic water and sanitation. So this set of norms and standards distinguishes between different levels of sanitation service. So the very lowest level of service, which is the service about sort of having hardly anything at all, is the interim level of service. And even this interim level of service requires a functional hand washing facility. You can see there the standard that I've just snapshotted from the policy talks about having even for household shared or communal toilets, a functional hand washing facility, which must be provided free of charge within 200 meters of the dwelling. And this responsibility for maintaining this facility lies with the services provider, which is the Water Services Authority. This level of service is a minimum level of service and is hoped to be phased out by 2030, which would be in line with the SDGs. But now, the devil is in the detail. How many hand washing facilities for an interim basic sanitation service? Again, this is taken from the norms and standards. And you'll see there that the number of basins that should be provided is linked to the number of toilet seats. So for a communal toilet, the standard is 1 seat per 50 users, which means that if your standard then for the basin is 1 basin per 10 toilet seats, that we're looking at 1 basin per 500 users. Shared toilets is a little bit better, 1 basin per 80 users. So the difficult question we have to now face is, are these standards really still sufficient when we're talking about COVID-19 and the kind of hand washing and social distancing that is required? How are 500 people going to use 1 basin? And is that basin even functional? So then who is responsible for providing basic hand washing facilities? This is mainly the metropolitan district and local municipalities. The norms and standards do have other duties that vest in, for example, care facilities, schools, public spaces, libraries, etc. But for the most part, for interim basic services, we're talking about the municipalities, and those are the relevant provisions of the Water Services Act that establish that. Every water services authority must provide for measures to realize these rights of basic water and sanitation, and they must progressively ensure access to water services. So moving forward, I think that what is needed now that this water infrastructure has been sort of sent out, the National Department needs to urgently revisit these hand washing standards in the national norms and standards, and potentially also liberate the linkage from toilet seats. Why should the number of basins be linked to the number of toilet seats when you need to wash your hands for many other reasons, and now especially as a frontline defense against the pandemic? And then our focus needs to shift to the municipalities, away from the National Department. We need these municipalities to maintain and replenish the water tanks. We need to also ensure that they look at the provision of hand washing facilities in their water services development plans, which is part of their statutory obligations. So that concludes my webinar. If you have any comments or insights, please don't hesitate to contact me at this email address. I hope this has given you some insight into hand washing facilities as a human right. Thank you very much for your attention. Stay safe and wash your hands regularly.